Hello and welcome to my channel. On my channel, I tell you about historical events in the form of bedtime stories. Sit back, learn about historical topics, and get ready for bed. First of all, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and leave a comment. Drapdray. The voice of Bejanks. Female desire in the ancient world history is, more often than not, a narrative written in by the powerful. Empires, male rulers, and their victory anthems. But beneath this great noise of history, a far older and far deeper voice flows. The voice of love between women. This voice sometimes trembles in a poem, sometimes hides in a figure etched on a cave wall, sometimes holds its breath between the lines of a medical text. But it never falls entirely silent. In this documentary, we will let you hear that silent voice. We will embark on a journey stretching from ancient Sumer to the Ottoman palace, from the sun-drenched islands of ancient Greece to the courts of China's Tang dynasty, from the monasteries of Renaissance Italy to the Boston farms of the 19th century. This journey is not a document of identity politics. It is a historical record showing how one of humanity's most ancient emotions, a woman's love for another woman, existed, was suppressed, survived, and was narrated across thousands of years. Approximately 4,000 years ago, in the fertile lands of Mesopotamia, humanity's first known written literature was being born. Among these first texts carved in cuneiform on clay tablets were hymns, prayers, and poems written in Sumerian. And some of these poems were dedicated to a goddess named Inanna. Inanna was not only the goddess of love and fertility, she was also the symbol of desire, passion, and sexuality. In some hymns written to Inanna, the closeness between the goddess and other goddesses or female figures is described with a marked emotional intensity. While scholars continue to debate the full meaning of these texts, it appears that this first written culture encompassed love between women as at least a part of its strid narratives. The figure who steps onto the historical stage more powerfully than these nuances of mythosomia is the poet of the island of Lesbos, Sappho, who lived from approximately 670 to 70 BCE, has gone down in history as one of the oldest and most influential voices in the Western poetic tradition. In the world of ancient Greece during Sappho's time, women were largely confined to the domestic sphere, the oikos. Women's access to public education, political participation, and social visibility was extremely restricted. The island of Lesbos was somewhat different from the cities on the Greek mainland. Here, women organized educational communities centered around music, poetry, and dance. These communities were called theazoi, and Sappho is thought to have been both the founder and the soul of one such. The poems that have survived from Sappho to the present day are extremely few. It is known that, in antiquity, she had a corpus of 9 books. However, most of this corpus has been lost over the centuries or deliberately destroyed. What remains are fragments, broken lines, disjointed verses, and only a single complete poem. But even these fragments contain some of the most powerful love poems in history. Sappho's only poem to survive in complete form, known as Hymn to Aphrodite, concerns the love a woman feels for another woman. In the poem, the narrator implores the goddess of love Aphrodite to make the woman she desires happy and return to her. Aphrodite speaks within the poem as a goddess and asks the narrator, "Who this time wounds you? Who is leaving you?" In this poem, both the pain of desire and of love are expressed in a universal language. And the desire in this poem is clearly directed from one woman to another. In her other fragments, Sappho writes, in dizzying language of women whose beauty she describes, lovers whose blonde hair, soft hands, and sweet voices she recounts. In the famous fragment beginning, "He seems to me a be like the gods, that man sitting opposite you. Close by listening to your sweet voice." Sappho describes a woman she is jealous of for sitting beside another man. She conveys with extraordinary psychological precision how her heart pounds, her tongue fails, her eyes grow dark. These lines are among the first great expressions in literature, not only of lyric poetry, but also of desire between women. In the ancient world, Sappho's poems were received with great admiration. Yet, over time, they provoked serious tension. Plato described Sappho as the 10th muse. Aristotle spoke of her mastery in the art of speech. However, by the Byzantine era, church authorities deemed Sappho's poems morally corrupting and had much of them destroyed. This destruction was a deliberate attempt to erase history, and this erasure itself is proof of how powerful and how threatening what those poems described was considered to be. The ancient Greek world held a rather complex and contradictory attitude toward relationships between women. Loving relationships between men, particularly pederastic relationships between younger and older men, were placed within a cultural and philosophical framework and were sometimes seen as an expression of virtue, education, and elevated love. Relationships between women were documented far less, since women's visibility in public life was far more limited. Their relationships were reflected far less in written records. Nevertheless, it is possible to see traces of closeness between women in ancient Greek mythology. The relationship between Artemis and her nymphs, or the narrative of Demeter and Persephone, sometimes reflects strong bonds between women. Even more interesting are the images encountered in certain ancient Greek vase paintings. In these vase painting, female figures embracing or kissing one another appear. Archaeologists debate the exact meanings or the sizing of these scenes, but the very existence of these figures shows that they're the least a reflection of closeness between when in an ancient Greek visual culture. When we move to the ancient Roman world, the picture becomes somewhat more complex. Rome was deeply influenced by Greek culture, but it also developed its own legal and moral norms. In Roman law, sexual relations between men were tolerated under certain conditions, or at least not subject to legal sanctions. This tolerance was largely based on sharp social hierarchies regarding active and passive sexual roles. Relationships between women, however, barely appear in Roman legal documents. This partly because women's sexual subjectivity was not reflected in official records. But there are traces of these relationships in Roman literature. The poet Martial, in his epigram poems written in the 1st century, describes a woman named Bassa who has relationships with other women. The tone of this poem is derogatory and clearly contemptuous. But this contempt, paradoxically, is proof that these relationships genuinely existed. In Lucian's dialogues, a woman named Liena narrates her relationship with another woman named Megilla. This dialogue is one of the rare direct depictions in ancient literature of sexual union between women. The medical texts of the Roman physician Soranus address relationships between women in a very interesting context. Soranus describes women he calls tribiads, that is, women who have sexual relations with other women, and treats this not as a disease or physical anomaly, but as a character trait or habit. This medical approach is extreme for showing how relationships between women were positioned in ancient Roman medical thought. Ancient Egypt presents an interesting picture at this point. Egyptian civilization, with its history spanning thousands of years, has left a small but extremely striking body of documentation regarding relationships between women. The most important of these is a tomb in the Giza necropolis, dating to approximately 400 BCE. While this tomb belongs to two men, Neankhnum-M and Khnum-Hotep. The tomb walls show the two figures depicted embracing each other, face to face, a representational tradition used in ancient Egypt exclusively for married couples. While direct evidence of relationships between women in Egypt is scarcer, some medical peri and ritual texts suggest fleshed closeness between women was part of the cultural imagination. Chapter 2. In the shade-out of sacred texts, medieval Europe and an evil world in this world with the fall of the Western Roman Empire and spread Christianity across the European continent, cultural attitudes toward relationships between changed profoundly. However, this change did not mean the disappearance of these relationships. Rather, their suppression and concealment, as historian Judith Brown has shown in her works. The medieval actually paid far less attention to sexual relations between women and made far fewer regulations about them. Primary reason of this was that female sexuality was generally rendered invisible and trivialized in the world dominated by Christian theology in evil Europe. Canon lawyers defined sexuality largely along the axis of reproduction. Within this definition, the concept of sodomia was a broad category encompassing all non-reproductive sexual relations. But the way this category was applied differed markedly by gender. Sexual or relations between men were swin-mimmed, restrained based on biblical accounts of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and were sometimes met with severe punishments extending to the death penalty. Relations between women, however, were barely mentioned in most church texts, touched upon only with brief and vague expressions. This did not mean that relationships between women did not exist. On the contrary, It meant that these relationships were considered too dangerous to document, or not worth documenting. Medieval monasteries offer an extremely interesting field in this context. Monastic life, over the centuries, created a space of akin and spiritual, and both men and women was as impossible outside. And in this space of freedom, there is abundant evidence that deep emotional bonds between women formed. Hildegard von Bingen, one of the most brilliant and influential female thinkers of the 12th century, is an interesting example in this context. Hildegard has gone down in history as the founder of the Rupertsberg Monastery in the Rhineland, a theologian, musician, physician, and visionary. But she is also known for the deep and passionate relationship she formed with a young nun named Richardis von Stade. Letters Hildegard wrote to Richardis clearly reveal an extremely intense emotional bond. When Richardis was assigned to another monastery, wrote letters to the Pope and German bishops imploring them to stop this assignment. The language she uses for Richardis in her letters is full of longing, pain, and love. While modern readers hold different views on how to name this relationship, the historical reality of the relationship dispute. The concept of spiritual friendship held an important place in medieval monastic life. This concept began to become more pronounced from the 12th century onward in both Christian and Muslim monk and dervish traditions. These relationships of spiritual companionship sometimes contained an extremely intense emotional intimacy. Allard of Revolx's thoughts developed in his work on spiritual friendship can be read as even implying that this intimacy might encompass physical dimensions. Aylward is also careful not to cross this line. One of the most striking sources used in documenting relationships between women in medieval Europe is Inquisition records. The case of Catherine of Heidsieldorfer, tried in southern Germany at the beginning of the 15th century, is an extremely rare and valuable document in this field. Heidsieldorfer was tried for having relationships with women and was executed in Flensburg for 77. The case records contain the testimonies of witnesses and convey Heidsieldorfer's relationships in considerable detail. This document is both tragic and extremely historically important. It presents one of the rare pieces of evidence confirming that legal sanctions were applied to such relationships in medieval Europe. On the other hand, when we look at the Islamic world, a far richer and more diverse picture presents itself. Early Islamic theology and law used the terms sihak or musahaka to describe sexual relations between women. Legal approaches differed according to the four major schools of Islamic law. But in general, these relationships were met with lighter sanctions than male-male relations, or were subject to no sanctions at all. During the Abbasid Caliphate, the literary culture flourishing in Baghdad in the 9th and 10th centuries produced works that explicitly described love between women. Writers such as Al-Jayz mention Al-Jay women who loved female lovers in their works describing various human typologies. Among love poems and treatises written in this period, there are texts that sometimes explicitly address desire between women. The Arabian Nights, also known and found as 1001 Nights, is an extremely interesting source in this regard. In various versions of this vast collection, there are stories that explicitly address sexual relations between women. Some of these stories are conveyed in a derogatory or comic tone, but some contain narratives that center female desire and treat it positively. The existence of these stories that relationships between women were at least part of the cultural imagination in the early Islamic world. Ottoman Haddon documents from the 16th and 17th centuries sometimes contain indirect or direct references to relationships between women. The harem was a space alated from the outside where large numbers of women lived together, and it is known that close relationships between women developed in this environment. Some medical texts from the Ottoman period and warnings by preachers to their congregations explicitly express their concern about this closeness in the harem. Moving outside the Middle East to South Asia, we encounter a different picture from centuries past. The Kama Sutra, composed by Vatsyayana in approximately the 4th century CCE, is known to be based on older sources. This text contains explicit descriptions of sexual union between women. The Kama Sutra does not characterize these relationships as problematic or abnormal. On the contrary, it treats them as part of the broad and diverse landscape of human sexuality. It is also possible to see traces of this diversity in Indian temple architecture. Among the temple reliefs of Khajuraho dating to the 10th and 11th centuries, there are figures that explicitly depict union between women. These reliefs are not purely sexual in content. They are part of a universal symbolism encompassing Bine, energy, fertility, and every dimension of life. But the very existence of these figures also shows that relationships between women were represented in the art and religious symbolism of that era's India. Chapter 3. The gardens of the East, China, Japan, and South Asia. Ancient China left an extremely rich documentary legacy regarding relationship. The most distant parts of this legacy are hidden in records belonging to imperial courts. In Chinese court culture, concubines and ladies-in-waiting admitted to the emperor's harem lived together in large numbers. The relationships that developed among these women are sometimes explicitly mentioned in court chronicles. During the Han Dynasty, the harem of Emperor Chang, thought to have lived in the 1st century BCE, entered historical records in this regard. According to what court historians report, the emperor's favorite Fayan and her sister Faisal were at the center of rumors about relationships between women in the harem. Whether these narratives are history, rumor, or political slander is still debated. But even this debate itself shows how deeply established these relationships were in the cultural imagination of the time. The Tang Dynasty period is known as one of the most brilliant cultural eras in Chinese history. During this period spanning the 7th through 10th centuries CCE, female painters, and thinkers occupied the center of cultural life in China. Yu Xuanji, one of the important female poets of the period, is described in some 19th century interpretations as a poet who wrote on the topic of lesbianism. However, this interpretation is contested. What is certain is this: Yu Xuanji's poems carry an extremely bold voice for their time, centering female desire and freedom. During the Song Dynasty, particularly in southern China, traditions of female solidarity known as nunciators or sworn companions developed. These traditions involved rituals in which women gathered to take oaths of sisterhood and pledge to support one another for life. Some historians argue that these solemn solidarity also encompassed, or laid the groundwork for, romantic bonds between women. One of the most striking examples of Chinese literature concerning relationships between women is the novel Flowers in the Mirror, written in the 17th century. This novel, written by Rushan, is one of the rare texts to survive to the present day, and contains sections that explicit depict emotional and romantic bonds between women. The novel has a complex structure that combines criticism with fantastic element and occupies a pioneering position in Chinese literature with its approach centering women's experience. During the Qing dynasty, there is strong evidence that an extremely interesting social institution developed in the Guangdong region of southern China. This tradition, known as Zijunu, or women who bind their own hair, involved a solidarity network in which refused marriage or from it to lead an independent life. These women, working in southern China's silk industry, supported by their economic independence, lived together in communal living spaces called sisterhood houses. The development of romantic and sexual relationships among women living in these houses has been documented through both historical narratives and oral history studies from this period. This tradition was not merely an individual escape, but a social resistance. With these women who rejected the institution of marriage, the patriarchal pressures of village society, and the exclusion of women from public life, established their own self-governed communities. Even in death, they did not break from this tradition. Some women who bound their own hair performed a symbolic wedding ceremony with another woman and wished to be buried beside this spouse at death. Moving to Japan, we see how relationships between women were shaped in a completely different cultural context. In Japanese literature from the Heian period, that is, in texts written in the 10th through 12th centuries, emotional closeness between women sometimes appears. In the tale of Genji, written by Lady Murasaki, and considered the world's first novel, the complex network of relationships among courtiers presents her encompassing both rivalry and deep emotional intimacy. In the Edo period, artistic productions dealing with love and desire between women emerged in Japan's urban culture, particularly in connection with kabuki theater and the ukiyo-e artistic tradition. Some shunga, that is, erotic prints, produced by print technique during this period explicit depicted sexual union between women. These prints were purchased and consumed by both male and female audiences. In Southeast Asia, an entirely different cultural framework regarding relationships between women presents itself. In traditional cultures of the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, and other Southeast Asian countries, gender is found to be constructed in ways that differ from the Western binary structure. Traditions such as the Bayot tradition in the Philippines, the Kathoy entity in Thailand, or the gender cultures of various regions of Indonesia provide a complex context for understanding how relationships between women were positioned. In some of these cultures, relationships between women were accepted as part of social norms, while in others they were regarded as taboo. Chapter IV. The Ancient Wisdom of the New World. Indigenous cultures in the Americas long before European colonizers set foot on the American continent. The rich and diverse indigenous cultures of this continent experienced gender and sexuality within a far more flexible and multi-layered structure. This tradition, partly described today by the concept of two-spirit, encompassed individuals born in male or female bodies, living with an identity different from the roles society assigned to men or women. The roles of these individuals in some tribes were extremely important. They functioned as healers, prophets, spiritual guides, tribal mediators. These diverse identities, documented throughout history and spread across hundreds of indigenous cultures of America, were known by different names in each culture. Nadli in Navajo culture, Winkta in Lakota culture, Lamana in Zuni culture. These terms reflect each culture's own unique cosmology and understanding of gender, and squeezing them into a single Western identity category inevitably loses something. But within these traditions, the existence of anatomically female persons who had relationships with other female or two-spirited individuals has been clearly documented. These relationships were considered normal and even honorable in many cultures. European colonization largely destroyed or drove underground this cultural diversity. But some cultures managed to preserve these traditions in different forms. When we look at Central America, we see that the Aztec and Maya civilizations left very few documents on this subject. The primary reason for this is that Spanish colonialism largely destroyed or completely eliminated the libraries and archives of these civilizations. As in the well-known case of Fray Diego de Landa burning Maya books in 1562, colonial violence was simultaneously the violent erasure of cultural memory. Nevertheless, in some surviving Aztec and Maya texts, individuals who step outside gender norms are mentioned. Turning to the Andean civilizations of South America, some archaeological and oral evidence from the Inca Empire period points to relationships between women. Spanish chronicler Pedro Cieza de Leon, in text he composed in the 16th century, mentions individuals living outside gender norms in Andean societies. among these individuals, alongside male-bodied persons who dressed and behaved like women. Relationships between women are also touched upon. One of the most striking dimensions of this cultural diversity is the resistance and flexibility shown by indigenous cultures against the violently heteronormative pressure brought by European colonialism. Conquistadors and the missionaries who followed them characterized the sexual and gender diversity in these cultures as diabolical or contrary to nature, and attempted to eliminate this diversity with crude repression. But even centuries later, traces of these traditions continued to live on in many indigenous cultures. Chapter V. Eclec's Legacy. Relationships between women in Africa. The African continent has carried an extremely rich and complex legacy regarding relationships between women throughout history. But understanding this legacy is extremely difficult, both because of the devastation left by colonialism and the biases in how Western academia has interpreted African cultures. In South Africa's Zulu culture, it is known women formed close relationships among themselves, called inkachain. These relationships contained deep emotional bonds, mutual gifts, jealousy, and devotion within a structure that, by some interpretations, could also include a sexual dimension. The important point is this: these relationships were accepted in Zulu culture as a legitimate form of intimacy lived outside marriage and family. Similar forms of close female relationships appear in various African cultures by different names. In some West African societies, women entered into long-term emotional and economic solidarity with one another in the absence of love of men who had lost their lives in wars or trade journeys or were away from home for long periods. When asked whether these relationships had a sexual dimension, it can be seen that available sources give no clear answer to this question. But it is clear that the relationships had a binding, deep, and socially recognized structure. In the Lesotho culture of southeastern Africa, the practice of young women forming relationships as mummy baby has been documented by anthropologists since the 19th century. These relationships involved a deep emotional attachment, mutual care, and love between an old woman and a younger one. Feminist anthropologist Judith Gay's field research in Lesotho in the 1980s revealed that these relationships might also include sexual dimensions. These relationships became widespread before marriage and could continue after marriage. But these relationships were experienced by Lesotho women, not as a matter of identity, as natural form of bonding in everyday life. In North Africa, the picture is very different. Although relationships between women have been hidden from public life, in this region, where Islamic culture predominates, their traces can be seen in both literary and oral traditions. In North African cities that partially carry the legacy of ancient Egypt, there are late Ottoman and colonial era documentations of closeness between women developing in social spaces such as hammams. The most destructive legacy of the colonial and maybe may be the widespread belief that homosexuality was imported into Africa from the West. This claim is entirely historically incorrect, and the use of this claim as a political argument by many anti-African leaders has caused the truth to become even murkier. On the contrary, historical evidence shows now not that homosexuality came to Africa with colonialism, but that Victorian-era moral values and the stance of Christian missionaries, eugenics, against homosexuality imposed a foreign norm on Africa. Chapter Fancy. The Age of Renaissance and Reform. The 15th through 17th in Europe. The 15th and 16th centuries were an era of both intense Renaissance and profound social ruptures. During this period, relationships between women began to become more visible, while at the same time being met with harsher legal sanctions. The urban culture of Renaissance Europe developed, particularly in Italy's great trading cities, alongside the rediscovery of the individual and desire as an artistic object. Artistic works and literary texts produced in this period began to address love between women far more openly than in previous centuries. Ariosto's 16th century epic poem Orlando Furioso contains a section dealing with the love character named Fire Despina feels for another woman. This section is still known as one of the pioneering literary examples addressing this subject. Similarly, the novellas of Spanish writer María de Sayas y Sotomayor, written in the 17th century, draw attention with female characters depicted as equal to or superior to men. These characters sometimes feeling deep devotion toward one another. In French Renaissance literature, Pierre de Bontemps' work, Lives of Gallant Ladies, composed in the 50s and posthumously, devotes long and detailed sections especially to sexual relations between women in court circles. Brantôme does not convey these narratives in a derogatory tone. On the contrary, he documents these relationships with an extremely observant eye as a part of cultural reality. This text offers an unparalleled window into how widespread relationships between women were in the 16th century French court. During this period, the Protestant Reformation shook the power of the Church in England and Northern Europe, and this shaking paradoxically meant both more stringent moral supervision and a redefinition of autonomy in individuals' religious experience. Following the establishment of the Anglican Church, sanctions against homosexuality in English law were rearranged. The Sodomy Act of 533 prescribed the death penalty for sexual relations between men. But what is striking is this. Women were excluded from the scope of this law. This exclusion is a reflection of tradition of the invisibility of female sexuality, and is at the same time why women faced less legal pressure in this area. Toward the end of the 17th century, interesting documents began to appear in England among court journals and gossip texts regarding relationships between women. The relationship between Sarah Churchill, a senior female courtier in the court of King James II, and Queen Anne is of the most discussed historical relationships of this period. This relationship, intertwined with the political conflicts of the time, presents a complex picture where power, loyalty, intimacy intermingle. Some historians interpret this relationship as a platonic bond, while others, pointing to the emotional intensity in the letters and court rumors, argue that it had a romantic dimension. In Spain and Portugal, 17th century Inquisition records contain some cases regarding relationships between women. In a case in the Lisbon Inquisition archives, a woman named Filipa de Souza was tried on the allegation of having incestuous relations with her and defended herself by claiming this allegation was untrue. Such cases are rare, but they show that these relationships, at least sometimes noticed by authorities, and made the subject of questioning. During this period, Holland was one of Europe's most cosmopolitan and relatively free societies. The trading port of Amsterdam brought people from different cultures and traditions together. Diversity brought with it both intellectual freedom and a relative relaxation of social norms. Various texts addressing relationships between women were produced in Dutch theater during Literatuur. The same time, some family records and testament texts in Dutch archives contain expressions pointing to a long-standing cohabitation between two women. Chapter ver. The Age of Enlightenment and Revolution. The 18th century, was an era in which Enlightenment thought in Europe placed the concepts of individual freedom, reason, and natural rights at the center. During this period, the effort to systematically examine human behaviors and emotions intensified. And this effort at systematic examination inevitably began to encompass relationships between women as well. England, during the Enlightenment era, was the period when Sapphism, a concept derived from Sappho's name, began to appear in public discourse. This concept was used with a tone containing both curiosity and moral condemnation, but indicated that relationships between women were acknowledged as a certain social reality. Some satirical pamphlets and lampoon booklets published during this period addressed relationships between the ladies of the English court at the time in an ironic tone. One of the most interesting figures in this context is not Anne Lister, but the couple Eleanor Butler and Sarah Ponsonby, known as the Ladies of Llangollen, dating to the late 18th century. These two Irish aristocratic women, who left family Linleys in Ireland in 1878, settled in the Llangollen Valley of Wales and lived together for 34 years. This cohabitation made a great impression in the intellectual circles of the time. Names such as William Wordsworth, Robert Southey, and Edmund Burke visited the cupola. The couple became almost a symbol of the intellectual and cultural life of the era. Butler and Ponsonby described their own relationship to everyone as a romantic friendship. Except Wyansetly used in the 18th century English-speaking world to express the deep emotional bond between two women. But when one looks at their journals and letters, How intense and how inseparable this relationship was is clearly evident. Traces of similar romantic friendships can also both be seen in Eliza Haywood's narrative, Sarah Fielding's correspondence, other written sources of the period. The concept of romantic friendship became the official name given to relationships between women throughout the 18th and 19th centuries in both Europe and America. The ambiguity of this concept allowed both for the relationships to be visible and for the question of whether they had a sexual dimension to remain unasked. Historian Lillian Faderman, in her groundbreaking work on this subject, examined romantic friendships in 18th and 19th century and revealed how widespread and how diverse a dimension these relationships carried. In France, Enlightenment philosophical debate began to re-examine sexuality and desire from a naturalistic perspective. Denis Diderot's novel La Religieuse, The Nun, composed in the 1760s and published only after his death, concerns a woman's experience in a mass and a monastery, and within this experience, sexual pressure and desire between women occupy an important place. Diderot addresses this theme within a secular critical framework, and interprets this dynamic created by forced cohabitation of the monastic institution as a consequence of artificial repression of the religious institution. The transformation following the French Revolution then led to an extremely contradictory picture for relationships between women. On one side, the repressive attitude of the Jacobin Republicans. On the other, the ideal of revolutionary freedom. Marie Antoinette, before her execution, faced serious accusations of having relationships with other women. These accusations were largely the product of groundless propaganda created for political purposes. But at the same time, they also laid bare how the political culture of the time used the discourse of female perversion. In 18th century Germany, the relationship between medical discourse and relationships between women gained a new dimension. In German anatomy and physiology literature, discussions began about the body anatomy that would make sexual relations between women possible. These discussions were conducted within an erroneous medical framework based on the claim the tri-baned women generally had an abnormally enlarged clitoris. This framework would also deeply influence the next century's medical discourse. Looking at Russia, one of the most striking examples of the 18th century appears in the court of Empress Catherine I. In court chronicles and diplomatic correspondence, close relationships among court ladies of the period, sometimes mentioned in brief passages. As a more directed example, the short story Natalia, the Boyar's Daughter, composed in 1792 by the great Russian writer Nikolai Karamza, places the deep emotional bond between two women in a central position. How romantic this bond is require an extremely careful reading of the text for this period. The existence of the bond is beyond dispute. Chapter Burr. The inconsistency of the Victorian era. The 19th century. The 19th century presents An picture for relationships between women, both in Europe and in North America. On one side, the harsh moral norms of the Victorian era and the strict supervision of erotic life. On the other, the extremely deep woman-to-woman cohabitations that flourished from within these norms and were lived openly. The most striking figure of this period is undoubtedly Anne Lister. Born in Yorkshire in 7791, Lister left the most detailed and most candid sexual autobiography of her era in her journals. Lister wrote the sensitive sections of her journals in a cryptographic system she herself invented. It took more than 200 years to decipher this system. The journals honestly recount Lister's relationships, many women, her sexual experiences, jealousies, separations, and most importantly, the informal marriage ceremony she performed with Anne Walker. Lister and Walker formalized their union through a ceremony in which they took communion together at Holy Trinity Church in 1834. This is one of the documented first same-sex union ceremonies in English history. And Lister was extremely clear about how she named her own identity. In her journals, she wrote openly about her attraction to other women and the physical dimensions of this attraction, defining herself as someone by nature of this orientation. Lister never fully violated the social norms of her time, but at the same time never internalized them. From her style of dress to her attitudes and behaviors, she lived at the boundary of, or outside the expectations of her era. During Anne Lister's lifetime, particularly in North America, a phenomenon known as Boston marriages was becoming increasingly widespread. This concept described relationships in which two women lived together, were bound to one another economically and emotionally, and society granted a certain legitimacy to this cohabitation. The great majority of these women were connected to the feminist or social reform movements of the era. Many were educated, economically independent, and electorally active individuals. Jane Addams, known as a social reformer and Nobel Peace Prize laureate, lived a deep relationship with Mary Rosette Smith throughout her life. This relationship lasted 40 years. Addams and Smith planned trips for each other, cared for each other's health, and addressed each other with an extremely sincere love in their letters. Addams never defined this relationship before the public, but equally, she never denied it. This relationship is a striking example of how powerfully the late 19th century American feminist movement was built on women-to-women bonds. The relationship between Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Fields, also extremely important in this context. Jewett is one of the important 19th century American women writers. Fields is the wife of a publisher at the center of Boston's cultural life. The two began living together after Fields' husband's death, and this cohabitation lasted approximately 20 years. The literary and cultural circles of the era found this relationship entirely natural, and Fields maintained a mutually nurturing cohabitation that made great contributions to both of their intellectual and artistic development. In the second half of the 19th century, medical discourse began to reframe relationships between women. English doctor James George Kiernan, German psychiatrist Carl Friedrich Otto Westphal, in the 1860s and 1870s, developed the concept of contrary sexual feeling. This concept defined attraction a person felt toward individuals of their own gender as a congenital, acquired disorder. Richard von Krafft-Ebing, one of the founders of this new branch of medicine known as sexology, classified rosified relationships between women in detail and addressed them within a pathological framework in his 1886 work, Psychopathia Sexualis. The effects of this medical discourse were extremely contradictory. On one side, by defining relationships between women as illness or perversion, this discourse laid the groundwork for serious social stigmatization. On the other, this discourse paradoxically made these relationships visible and offered women living these relationships a language to make sense of their own experiences. In the late 19th century, the rising consciousness of identity in cities like Vienna and Berlin both clashed with and fed from this medical discourse. In Germany during this period, Karl Heinrich Ulrich emerged as an important figure. Ulrich developed an understanding not only for male-male relations, but also encompassing female-female relations within the sexual category he called earning. This understanding contained the first seeds of the later homosexual rights movements. In France, the 19th century was a period when literature began to address love between women increasingly openly. Théophile Gautier's Un Taldrin 35 novel, Mademoiselle de Maupin, entered a literary history as a work centering a female character who subverts gender norms and positively depicting desire between women. In Charles Baudelaire's poetry collection, The Flowers of Evil, a poem called Lesbos, dedicated to love between women, appeared. However, this poem was censored and removed in the first edition. Zola, Balzac, and the other masters of the realist novel also included relationships between women in their works from this period. They position these relationships as a symptom of degeneration, perversion, or social decay. Chapter Amex, Art and Freedom. Fin de siècle and the turn of the century, the 19th and early 20th centuries are an extremely critical period for relationships between women. The modernism movement rising in Europe's great cities was questioning social norms. Women's freedom movements were gaining strength, and in this environment, relationships between women began to become more visible and became the object of more intense cultural conflicts. Paris was the center of this period. In the cafes of the Montparnasse district, the cabarets of Montmartre, and the intellectual salons of the left bank, artists, writers, and thinkers from every corner of the world gathered. And within these communities, relationships between women became largely an accepted norm. American writer and art collector Natalie Barney was one of the most central figures of this period. Barney transformed her salon on Rue Jacob and into an intellectual center that brought together the leading names of the era. Every Friday evening, Among those who attended Barney's salon were names such as Gertrude Stein, Rainer Marielke, Anatole France, Isadora Duncan, Denkin, and Brackleaf Hall. Barney never hid her homosexuality. On the contrary, she embraced it as a way of life and defended it with an almost philosophical stance, deeply devoted to Greek antiquity, particularly the legacy of Sappho. Barney sometimes organized poetry readings dedicated to Sappho in her salon and staged costumed performances inspired by Greek mythology. This an active reclaiming of a historical identity. And it is clear that this was a conscious cultural act. During the same period, the relationship between Gertrude Stein and Alice B.P. Toklas went down in history as one of the longest-running and best-documented female-female-female coverteros. Stein and Toklas met in Toklasvet in 1907 and lived together until Stein's death in 1946. Toklas was an inseparable part of both Stein's personal and professional life. While Stein conversed with other male artists during lunch, Toklas would converse with their wives in a separate sitting room, an ironic picture of how deeply the gender norms of the era were internalized. Brackleaf Hall's als 1920-28 novel, The Well of Loneliness, represents one of the most important rupture points of this period. The novel concerns the identity of a female character named Stephen Gordon. The author defines this identity with the medical terminology of the time as inverted. The novel contained neither erotic content nor explicit sexual descriptions. But British authorities banned the book obscene and banned it. The expression marked the banning process was the publisher presents abnormal relationships as natural and healthy. This expression is like a summary of the institutional attitude toward relationships between women during that period. The banning of The Well of Loneliness in England, but its release in America, laid bare transatlantic cultural differences, but in both cases, this novel reached hundreds of thousands of readers and continued for decades after to be important reference points, many women seeking a language to describe their own experience. During this period in Germany, there was an entirely different picture. Berlin became the world center of homosexuality research, with the Institut für Sexualwissenschaft, Institute for Sexual Science, founded in 1919 by Magnus Hirschfeld. This institute compiled an extremely broad archive on relationships between women. It conducted work in this field both clinically and academically in the relatively free atmosphere of the Weimar Republic. Berlin's women's bars, cabarets, and spaces belonging to homosexual communities experienced a short but brilliant period of cultural flowering before confronting the atrocities of the Nazi regime in the advancing decades. In Japan during this period, romantic friendships in girls' schools, known as Class S, gradually gained increasing social visibility. These intense emotional connections formed among female students inspired Japanese literature of the era. Yoshia Nobuko, through the novels she wrote in the 1920s and 1930s and 1930s, became a pioneer of a narrative tradition centering these romantic relationships in girls' schools. It is known that Nobuko also lived such a relationship in her own life. She lived with Mamichio Fuji for decades. Chapter Dex. The interwar period and gathering storm clouds. The First World War profoundly shook European societies, and this shaking led to fundamental changes in gender norms as well. During the war, as millions of men went to the front, women moved into more active positions in economic and social life. This process prepared the ground for the expansion of women's autonomy, both practically and symbolically. And this expansion also contributed to relationships between women becoming somewhat visible. The atmosphere of the 1920s, Roaring Twenties, offered quite favorable ground in this context. Aside from Paris's left-wing cultural environment mentioned above, the Harlem Renaissance in New York, one of the most remarkable cultural explosions of this period. The Harlem Renaissance was also an era in which many black female artists lived their relationships one another in relatively open ways. Alongside the great creative flowering of black art, music, and literature, Muraney, one of the first great stars of blues music, sang songs dealing with desire between women. The lyrics of half her song Prove It on Me Blues carried content that questioned gender norms and implied her relationships with women. Muraney lived this orientation in her own life with almost no concealment. The women she was involved with came from ladies, musicians, dancers, and audiences. Some of Bessie Smith's songs and way of life have been similarly interpreted. The black women's blues tradition of this period constitutes one of the rare examples of both musical and personal freedom. In Weimar Germany, parallel to the sexual science environment mentioned, cultural production aimed at homosexual women reached an unprecedented dimension. The journal Die Freundin, The Female Friend, published in Berlin, and one of the first periodicals explicitly addressing relationships between women while targeting female readers, was published from Munden 4 to 1904, Twen to War to 933. With the Nazi regimes coming to power, its institute was destroyed, archives were burned, and the relatively free space created during this brief period was completely eliminated. The Second World War meant both destruction and, paradoxically, the acceleration of some social changes. During the war period, the employment of women in military service units and the war industry created environments of intense cohabitation between women. It is known relationships between women occurred both in the American Women's Army Corps and in the British ATS. Some of these relationships were recorded in memoirs and oral history studies in subsequent decades. Chapter Thuxon, The Cold War and the Wove of Repression. Mid-20th century following the Second World War. In the Western world. On one hand, the rebuilding of post-war social norms, and on the other, the atmosphere of paranoia during the Cold War prepared the ground for intense pressure against homosexuality. This period is when both legal pressure and cruel stigmatization were experienced in their most intense form. In the United States, McCarthyism during the Cold War era defined homosexuality not just as a moral perversion, but also as a threat to national security. A 1953 presidential executive order, the employment among federal government employees. During this period, hundreds of people were dismissed from federal and state institutions on charges of homosexuality or forced to resign. This period, called the Lavender Scare, created an extremely oppressive environment for homosexual men. In this oppressive environment, relationships between women largely went underground. But at the same time, the first seeds of social organization against this pressure were being sown the same period. The Daughters, founded in 1955 in San Francisco by Del Martin and Phyllis Lahn, was America's first homosexual women's organization. The organization's name made reference to a fixed Greek island taken from a poetry book inspired by the Sappho tradition. Published in 1994 by French poet Pierre Louis. This choice of name was a reflection both of intellectual consciousness and at the same time a protective concealment made avoid official surveillance. Daughters of Bilitis began publishing a journal called The Ladder. For more than a decade, this journal was filled with the writings, letters, and commentary of women who lived as they did. This journal served an important function in establishing both identity and community bonds for many women isolated by social norms. In England, the 1957 Warfenden Report, while proposing the partial decriminalization of male homosexual relations, discussed relationships between women not at all. The reason this was that these relations were not yet defined in law. This strange legal gap once again revealed a strange cringe combination of the invisibility and vulnerability female sexuality. In France, Germany, and other Western European countries during this period, similar patterns of repression were also experienced. But the intensity and form of repression varied from country to country. The Scandinavian countries, particularly Sweden and Denmark, displayed far more attitude during this period compared to other Western countries. Chapter 2: Cultural Revolutions and New Voices. The 1960s and 80s. The cultural revolution of the 1960s prepared the ground for fundamental questioning of social norms, bravistro norms, in Western Europe and in North America. This period was one of decades in which the rise of the feminist movement, the civil rights struggle, and the homosexual liberation movement fed and strengthened one another. The 1969 Stonewall Uprising is known as the symbol of the history of homosexual rights, but that the role of women in this uprising is sometimes pushed to the background. On that night at the Stonewall Inn, both gay men and lesbian women, both white and people of color, resisted police pressure. Names such as Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson were among the key figures in this resistance. In the activist networks established after Stonewall, lesbian women formed a powerful voice, organizing both among themselves and in the general homosexual liberation movement, the feminism rising in the 1970s, especially the radical feminist movement, reframed the concept of lesbianism as both a political and personal category. Tigrace Atkinson's expression, lesbianism is a political choice, became one of the era's controversial but influential slogans. Adrienne Reach, in her groundbreaking One Intel Day 88 article, Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence, argued that heterosexuality is a socialized compulsion, and that lesbianism contains the rejection of this compulsion. This article became extremely important text for feminist theory and was also widely debated. During this period, historians began to re-examine the history of relationships between women. Lillian Faderman's work, Surpassing the Love of Men, presented its comprehensive research on 19th century literature and romantic friendships to the public, showing that lesbianism existed with historical continuity. Carol Smith Rosenberg's 1975 article, The Female World of Love and Ritual, analyzed deep female-female relationships in 18th century American women's culture and revealed that these relationships were both widespread and a socially accepted phenomenon. Chapter Terror, The Global Picture, the Late 20th Century, and the Threshold of the New Millennium. In the last decades of the 20th century, globalization and the revolution in communication technology and technologies fundamentally transformed both the cultural and political context of relationships between women. While the AIDS crisis initially affected primarily gay male communities, this so simultaneous triggered the development of a strong solidarity culture in the homosexual community in general. The queer theory, rising in the 1990s, argued that gender and sexuality are not fixed categories, but products of social construction. Judith Butler's work Gender Trouble offered one of the most influential theoretical frameworks in this field. Butler's concept of performative gender resonated widely both in academia and in activist circles. During this period, South Africa became one of the first countries to include a provision in its constitution prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. This step was extremely meaningful historically, since such a powerful step toward legal equality was taken on the African continent, where such relationships had been suppressed for centuries. Nevertheless, the deep chasm between legal guarantees and social reality continued. Lesbian women in South Africa continued to face a brutal form of violence known as corrective rape. In South and Southeast Asia, the 1990s and 2000s were a period when homosexual activism and cultural visibility increased. In India, the 2009 High Court ruling finding IPC Section 3777 unconstitutional and the subsequent Supreme Court ruling completely lifting this beefing. This symbolized a major historical transformation. In China, homosexuality was removed from official psychiatric classification in 2001. But legal and social pressure continued in different forms Chapter Kavi. Memory, Identity, and History. On writing history, this point, it is necessary to step back and reflect on how we write and how we read history. Writing the history of relationships between women isn't an extremely difficult task, since this history has been exposed to both intentional and unintentional mechanisms that work to erase, suppress, or reinterpret it. The first problem is the historical specificity of the concepts used. Concepts such as lesbianism or homosexuality are products of the medical and psychological discourse of late 19th century Europe. Applying these concepts to ancient Greece or Ming Dynasty China involves a certain anachronism, but setting these concepts aside entirely creates other problems. It means failing to see the historical continuity of desire and devotion between women. The second problem is the structure of the sources. The great majority of historical sources produced by men and convey the world from a male's. Sources in which women convey their own experiences in their own voices are extremely rare, and this scarcity inevitably causes the historical picture to remain incomplete. The third problem is the selectiveness of surviving evidence. Works of art, literature, letters, journals, how many of these have survived by chance or deliberately? Most of Sappho's corpus was destroyed. The archives of Hirschfeld's Institute were burned. The common denominator of these destructions is the effort to erase what exists. But these erasures themselves are also historical evidence. To erase something, that thing must first exist. The fourth and perhaps most complex problem is how we will define a relationship between two women. Dip emotional bonds shared by a woman with another woman, if it is not romantic or erotic, fall within the scope of historiography? The answer to this question largely depends on the historian's theoretical framework. Historians like Lillian Faderman, rather than placing sexuality at the center of the definition, by focusing on emotional investment and primary bonds, have promoted a much broader historical picture. Others worry that this expanded definition would encompass female friendships with no connection to sexuality, rendering the concept meaningless. This debate is still ongoing and should continue to do so, because this debate is not merely an academic classification problem. It is a deep question about how we make sense of the past, the present, and the future. Chapter Kazi, Artists and Pioneers. The guardians of cultural memory history is not merely comprised of wars and empires. Sometimes the most powerful historical testimony is hidden in a painter's brush or a poet's verse. In narrating the history of relationships between women, artists, thinkers who have left their mark in this field must be examined more closely. Looking at the art of painting, among the figures Artemisia Gen's created in the 17th century, works depicting powerful female companionships hold a special place. The powerful canvas showing Judith and her maidservant killing Holofernes together, or the composition telling the story of Susanna and the elders, These works are products of an artistic sensibility centering female solidarity and powerful female companionships. In Gentileschi's depictions, one feels how deeply the bond between women encompasses a human reality. Centuries later, the works of French Impressionist Berthe Morisot offer a nuanced portrait of women's experience that transcends class and gender boundaries. Morisot painted the daily rituals of women's lives with extraordinary intimacy and sensitivity. American Impressionist Mary Cassatt carries the spirit of this era with both her pioneering role and the strong female bonds she formed with her sister Lydia and with the Parisian art world. At the beginning of the 20th century, Frida Kahlo openly reflected her bisexual desire in both her paintings and journals. The autobiographical expression of this dual desire lived in the shadow of her marriage to Diego Rivera, constituted an inseparable part of Kahlo's both political and artistic identity. Josephine Baker, in the middle of the Harlem Renaissance and Paris, almost never concealed her relationships with both male and female lovers in her both stage and private life. In the art of photography, Claude Cahun was one of the most prescient and most daring artists of the early 20th century. The Franco-British photographer and writer Cahun created self-portraits questioning gender norms and identity categories. While living on the island of Jersey, this is Malherbe, also known Marcel Moore, simultaneously her art partner and life partner. She conducted active resistance activities during the Nazi occupation and was sentenced to death for this. The war ended before the sentence was carried out. Chapter SV: The Legacy of Colonialism and Repression. Glow contexts. In many parts of the world, the existence of laws that still criminalize relationships between women is largely a reflection of legal norms inherited from the colonial period. This context is extremely important, since many of the repressive laws defended in the name of traditional values today are actually impositions of European colonial law. In the Indian subcontinent, Section 7777 of British colonial law imposed in India came into force in 1860 and homosexual relations as a crime for approximately 150 years. Yet, as conveyed above, in pre-colonial Indian culture, sexuality and gender were experienced within a far more flexible and multi-layered understanding. The Khajuraho reliefs and the diversity contained in the Kama Sutra are concrete evidence of this flexibility. Section 30777 placed an artificial clamp over the rich cultural tradition. A similar situation existed across much of Africa. The laws criminalizing homosexuality in more than 45 African countries today are largely continuations of legal frameworks imposed by British, French, Portuguese, and Belgian colonizers. The reference defenders of these laws make to African tradition is extremely problematic historically. Chapters accepta the never-ending struggle or resistance and solidarity. Despite all these historical suppressions, surveillance, sanctions, and silencing attempts, relationships between women continued to exist. This existence was sometimes lived in a poem, sometimes in a funeral ceremony, sometimes behind monastery walls, sometimes in the invisible corners of crowded cities. But it never completely disappeared. The forms of resistance were extremely diverse. Sometimes this resistance manifested as directly transforming language, like Supfo. Sometimes took the form of collective institutional resistance, like the women who bound their own hair of southern China. Sometimes it showed itself in the form of creating an intellectual culture, like in Natalie Barney's salon. Sometimes it took the form of a quiet but persistent organizational effort, like in the meetings Daughters of Bilitis held in a small apartment. The point where these forms of resistance came together is women built their own world of meaning. They made real in their own languages, their own rituals, and their own cohabitations what history and society said does not exist or should not exist. This founding act is extremely important, since the act of existing itself became a form of resistance. Chapter Theater. Intation and limits. The framework of historical science. This point, it is necessary to address the limits of historians and historiography. We know much about the events, persons, and relations conveyed from the beginning of this documentary. But we know far much more that we do not know. We cannot know with certainty whether Sappho actually experienced a desire toward her own gender, since we can reach her inner world only through her fragmented poems. We cannot know with certainty whether the relationship of the ladies of Llangollen had a sexual dimension, since this dimension was never shared with the pup. Do the references we identify in the written sources ancient Egypt reflect a real social practice or a symbolic language? This question remains largely unanswered. This uncertainty is an inevitable feature of history. The boundary between knowing history and constructing history is always permeable, but this permeability does not mean that history becomes meaningless. It means an obligation wiring that historical interpretation be reconsidered for each generation. The purpose of this documentary is not to provide definitive answers, but to offer a map for seeing the questions and following them. Throughout history, the love and desire that women for one another was never completely eliminated. Not by the medical discourse of the era that pathologized it, not by society's legal sanctions, not by the heavy veil of cultural silence. This is one of the most persistent and most resistant truths in the history of humanity. Chapter Zeni. The Mirror and the Future. Historical continuity. As we come to the end of this journey, it is necessary to pause for a moment and ask, what good does knowing this history do? Knowing this history, first of all, reminds us of how diverse and how rich humanity is. The love and desire between women has a history of thousands of years. This history is not the property of a particular culture or period, but the common heritage of humanity. Knowing this history also helps to see the difference between what is natural and what is normal. Every era and every culture has produced its own understanding of norms. And these norms are both extremely different from one another and have changed profoundly over time, presenting the norms of any given era as universal nature is historically indefensible. Knowing this history also shows that repression was never completely successful. Sappho's corpus was destroyed, but the survivors echoed in lines in the minds of many people throughout subsequent centuries. The archives of Hirschfeld's Institute were burned, but the bearers of that knowledge scattered around the world, and the work of reassembling history continued. The communities of women who bound their own hair were dispersed, but their stories were passed down from generation to generation through oral tradition. And knowing this history reminds us, perhaps most profoundly, of this. Every era's effort to hear its own disappeared and suppressed voices is a moral obligation. Conclusion. Afterward. The voice which springs from history, the present thousands of years ago, on the sun-drenched shores of Lesbos. Sappho wrote a poem. While writing that poem, perhaps she was thinking of a woman who loved her or had left her. Perhaps she was simply putting into words desire itself. Indescribable and unstoppable feeling. Most of this poem no longer exists, but one thing remains, the act of writing the poem, and this act, carried together with all subsequent cultural memory, bears a single truth. Women loved one another. They did this in unprecedented forms, under repression, in the shadow of medical stigmatization, behind the walls of legal prohibitions, under the weight of social judgment, and they continued to do so. History tells us this. This love was never outside history. It always was history. It was simply, for too long, kept outside the way history was narrated. This documentary is as a small attempt to bring that excluded voice inside. Not perfect, incomplete, but necessary, because knowing history means not only understanding the past, it also means building the present and the future more honestly. This text is a draft academic cinematic script based on historically verified information, designed for approximately 4 hours of narration. History's Silent Loves narration script.